The first time I met her was at a restaurant, a nice place, white tablecloths, soft lighting. You'd think it would be comfortable. But the air at the table was so thick with tension you could almost see it. My husband David, he was trying so hard, laughing a little too loud, filling every silence with a story. But she just watched me. Her eyes were like two little chips of ice, scanning me, judging every word I said, the way I held my fork, the way I laughed. It was an inspection. And I was failing. I remember I brought a gift, a beautiful silk scarf the color of autumn leaves. I thought, it's a nice gesture, something to break the ice. She opened the box, nodded politely, and set it aside without a word, didn't even touch the fabric. The conversation would drift, and David would try to steer it towards safe topics. She's work the weather, but she always found a way to steer it back. Shed. Ask me a question about my family, my background. And her tone was just pointed, like she was digging for something, some flaw. The first time I went to her apartment with a pot of chicken soup, she wouldn't even look at me. She was propped up on the sofa, a blanket over her legs, staring at the television. I put the soup on the coffee table. I made you some lunch, I said. Her jaw was set. She muttered something about not being hungry, about not needing a babysitter. The pride was still there, a last line of defense. I just said, it's here if you want it. And I left. I didn't force it. I didn't try to make conversation. It explained the source of the poison. And I made a choice right then, a conscious, deliberate choice. I would not drink the poison. I would not retaliate. I would not become another link in that chain. The cycle would end with me. That decision was the real beginning. The hard part, choosing compassion over retaliation, is not a passive thing. It's an active daily fight. It's a battle you wage against your own instincts. Every time she made a pointed remark about my cooking, my instinct was to make a sharper one back. Every time she subtly excluded me from a conversation, my instinct was to withdraw completely, to build a higher wall. That's the easy path, that's the well-worn path of generational hurt. It's a groove so deep it feels natural. Fall into it. I had to fight that impulse every single day. It was exhausting. I would rehearse conversations in the car, not of confrontation, but of connection. I would prepare myself before seeing her, stealing my resolve to respond to bitterness with neutrality, and to any small openness with warmth. The goal was no longer to win her approval. That was a fool's errand. The goal shifted. It became about offering a new model, showing her what a relationship could look like when it wasn't based on power struggles and old wounds. It was about proving through action that there was another way. My mission became to offer care without any expectation of a reward, to nurture without demanding gratitude. It felt like throwing seeds onto barren ground, not knowing if anything would ever grow, but I kept throwing them. The opportunity to truly apply this philosophy came unexpectedly. She fell ill, nothing life-threatening, but a bad case of pneumonia that left her weak and bedridden for weeks. Your father was worried, but he's never been much of a caregiver. The practicalities overwhelmed him, and I saw my chance not to prove anything, but to actually practice what I had been preaching to myself. I started with food. It felt like the most fundamental, non-threatening way to care for someone, feeding as a balm for old wounds. I remembered things she had mentioned offhand years ago, a soup her own mother used to make a particular way. She liked her tea. I began cooking for her. It wasn't just about nourishment. Every chop of a vegetable, every stir of the pot was a meditation. This is not for me, this is for her. This is an offering of peace. I would bring the meals over in containers I knew she could easily reheat. I never stayed long at first. I'd just leave the food on the counter, exchange a few pleasantries with your father, and go. I didn't want her to feel obligated or cornered. It had to be a gift, freely given. The first few times there was no acknowledgement. But then one day your father called. He said she really liked the chicken and rice soup. Said it was just right. It was a small thing, a message passed through an intermediary, but it felt like crack in the ice. I kept going. Each meal was a quiet refusal to engage in the old battle. While her body was weak, her defenses were down. The usual armor of sharp words and cold looks was too heavy for her to carry. In that vulnerability she was finally receptive to the unconditional care. It was a language she hadn't encountered before, not the conditional love of "I will care for you if you meet my standards," but a simple, steady "I am here, and I will care for you because you need it." Left the food. I started staying a little longer. I'd help tidy up the kitchen. I'd sit in the chair across from her bed, and we wouldn't talk much. Sometimes I'd read a book and shed just doze. The silence between us changed. It was no longer hostile or anxious. It was just quiet, comfortable. The space was filled not with words, but with the simple act of being present. The turning point came about a month into her recovery. I had brought over a pot of stew. She was sitting up in bed looking stronger. I was about to leave when she spoke, her voice still a little rough, you know. She said, not looking at me, but at her hands on the blanket. My mother, she was a kind woman. But life was hard for her. She didn't have much kindness left to give. She paused for a long time. I think I became like that hard. I just stood there waiting. My heart was pounding. She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were clear, but full of a deep ancient sadness. This, she gestured weakly towards the pot of stew on the nightstand. This constant caring, I don't deserve it. And I said the only thing that felt true, it's not about deserving. She looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw the girl from the photograph again, the scared immigrant, and I saw the weary woman she had become. And in that look, I saw her truly see me not as an opponent, not as a symbol of something she resented, but as a person who had chosen to be kind. A few weeks later, when she was fully recovered, she asked me to come over for lunch, just the two of us. Your father made himself scarce. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table, where I had felt so judged for years. And she served me. She had made a meal. It was simple, but she had made it. And over that lunch, she said the words that broke the cycle for good. I was wrong about you. She said, her voice steady. I was protecting a hurt that wasn't yours to carry. What you've shown me, it's a different way. Thank you for your patience with an old woman. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was everything. Her acknowledgement was her own healing. By accepting my compassion, she was acknowledging the pattern she had been perpetuating. She was laying down her weapon, our new relationship. It's not a fairy tale. We're not suddenly the best of friends. But it's real. It's based on a mutual understanding of a battle that we both decided to end. It's a testament to the power of refusing to continue the hurt. And the legacy of that, it's not just for us, it's for you, and for any family that comes after. We created a new dynamic, a healthier one. We showed that cycles can be broken, that wounds can heal not by ignoring them, but by meeting them with a stubborn, relentless compassion. The inheritance I am proudest of isn't anything material. It's the knowledge that the chain of hurt people was snapped. And what we're building now, it's a new legacy, one of understanding, one of peace. The silence wasn't loud or angry, not after the first few months. It just settled in like a permanent layer of dust over everything. It became the default. For years we'd see each other at holidays, at birthdays, we'd be in the same room, breathing the same air, and the distance between us felt wider than any ocean. We'd perfected the art of the non-conversation. Pass the salt, please. The weather's turned cold. That was the extent of it. Polite, sterile, empty. The hurt from that initial rejection, it was like. That's when I decided to change my approach. I wasn't just going to make food, I was going to make her food. I started asking David quietly about the things she loved. When he was a kid, what did she cook on cold Sundays? What was the dessert she always made for his birthday? He told me about her pot roast, the way she'd braise it for hours with carrots and onions until the meat fell apart. He told me about a specific apple cake with a crunchy brown sugar topping that was his favorite. Third person in the room with us. A ghost everyone could see, but no one would acknowledge. We were both so stubborn. I think we were both waiting for the other to crack first, to offer some grand apology that would magically erase all those years. But the longer it went on, the more impossible it felt. The silence hardened into something solid, a wall we'd built brick by brick, and I think we both forgot there was a person on the other side. Then she got sick. It wasn't a secret. My husband told me, his voice tight with a worry he tried to hide. His mother had the flu, a bad one, and it had knocked her flat. She lived alone. The news landed in my stomach like a stone. All the old rules of our frozen war suddenly seemed childish, pointless. But how do you break a silence that's lasted for years? Picking up the phone felt like trying to lift a car. Any words I could muster would sound hollow, or worse, like an obligation. I couldn't just call and say, "Here you're a sick, hope you feel better." It would have been another layer of the same politeness that had kept us strangers. The words themselves were the problem. They had failed us too completely. So I decided not to use them at all. I went to the kitchen. It was the only language I had left that felt honest. I started with chicken soup. It felt like a cliché, but sometimes clichés exist for a reason. I chopped the onions, the carrots, the celery. I simmered the broth for hours, letting the scent of thyme and bay leaf fill the house. It was a quiet, deliberate process. I wasn't just making food. I was focusing all that complicated, unspoken feeling into something tangible. I put it in a simple glass container, wrote a note on a piece of paper, just 3 words, "Thinking of you." And I drove to her house. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't want to force an interaction. I left the container on her front step, sent a quick text to my husband to let her know it was there, and I left it felt like a secret mission, a peace offering without any terms of surrender attached. The next day my husband said she'd eaten it, that was all, no message back, no comment. But she'd eaten it, that tiny fact was a crack in the ice. A few days later, I made her a simple pasta dish, something easy to reheat again. I left it on the step again. I drove away. This became the new rhythm, the silent delivery. Id try to think of what she might like, what would be easy on her stomach. I made a creamy potato leek soup, a gentle rice porridge. I started paying attention through my husband to what she finished. And what was left over, she never liked mushrooms, I remembered. She always picked around them, so I stopped using them. She seemed to love the roasted tomato soup I started making, that more often. This was our new conversation. It was happening entirely in flavors and ingredients. The food was saying, I remember you don't like mushrooms. The empty container was her reply. Thank you for remembering a particularly hearty stew. Said, I know this is a tough recovery. Her acceptance of it. Said, I appreciate you seeing that. It was a dialogue without a single syllable. It was safe. There was no risk of saying the wrong thing, of reopening an old wound. We were building a new foundation, and it was made of soup and quiet care. This went on for weeks. Even after she was technically better, the deliveries became a habit, a thread, connecting our two separate houses. Then one afternoon my phone buzzed. It was a text message from her. My heart jumped into my throat. I opened it. It was just 2 sentences. Thank you for the soup today. It was delicious. That was it. But those were the first direct words she had spoken to me in nearly a decade. They weren't about the past. They weren't an apology or a confrontation. They were about the present. About the soup. They were an acknowledgement of this new fragile thing we were building. It was like the first tentative touch after a long separation. It broke the ice not with a sledgehammer, but with a warmth that finally began to thaw it. So I started there. I found a recipe for pot roast that sounded right, and I spent a whole Saturday making it. The apartment filled with that smell, that deep, savory, homey smell. I brought it over in a heavy ceramic pot. I didn't stay. I just said, David mentioned you liked pot roast. I saw a flicker of something in her eye. Surprise. Maybe before the guarded look came back, but she took it. The next time I brought food, I rang the bell. I heard her footsteps inside. A pause. And then the door opened. She stood there looking smaller than I remembered. But her eyes were clear. She smiled a little shyly. Come in. She said, I just made tea. I stepped inside her house, a place I hadn't entered in years. We sat at her kitchen table. At first we talked about the food. What kind of rice did you use in that dish? She asked. It had a wonderful texture. It was a safe topic, a neutral ground. We discussed recipes. The best place to buy herbs. The way a soup always tastes better the next day. But as we talked, sitting there with our teacups, the conversation slowly, gently began to expand. We talked about the neighbors, about a book she was reading. The words were no longer barriers, they were bridges. Carefully tested, the relationship was rebuilding itself slowly, word by word. But it was built on the silent understanding that had come before it. It was built on the memory of all those quiet meals, of a kindness offered without any expectation. We had found a way back to each other, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a bowl of soup, and the courage to say nothing at all, until the right moment came to speak. The first time I met his family, I knew. It was a look she gave me across the dining room table right after Id answered a question about where Id gone to college. It wasn't a state school, you see. It was the community college downtown, followed by night classes to finish my degree. I was proud of that. I worked 2 jobs to make it happen. But the look she gave me, it was a quick dismissive flicker of the eyes, followed by a tiny condescending smile. It was a look that said, oh, how quaint, and she made sure everyone at the table saw it. His aunts, his uncles, his cousins, they all saw that look, and that set the tone for everything that came after. It became her favorite sport. Family gatherings were her arena. Thanksgiving was the worst. It'd be in the kitchen, trying to help, and shed gently take a serving spoon from my hand. Oh no, dear. Let me do that. You just relax, and shed say it with a smile so anyone listening would think she was being considerate. But I knew she was telling everyone that I didn't know how to do it right, that I wasn't capable. Shed compare the store-bought pie I brought one year to her sister's from scratch recipe. Her voice light and teasing, but the barb was sharp and public. It's perfectly fine for something you just pick up, shed say, and the whole table would chuckle. I'd feel my cheeks burn, and I'd force a smile, my face aching with the effort. Family just watched. They'd sometimes get an uncomfortable look in their eyes, But no one ever said anything. It was easier to let her have her way. She was the matriarch, the one who held the family together. To challenge her was to risk exile, so they enabled her. They'd laugh a little too hard at her jokes at my expense. They'd nod along when she made some pointed comment about my job or my background, or the fact that we'd chosen a smaller, older house in the city instead of a new build in the suburbs like her other son. I felt like I was under a microscope at every birthday, every holiday, every casual Sunday barbecue. I was the specimen they were all examining, and she was the one pointing out all my flaws. The isolation was profound. I could be in a room full of 20 people, all of them related to the man I loved, and feel completely, utterly alone. My husband saw it. He hated it. At night after those awful gatherings, we'd lie in bed, and he'd whisper his apologies. He'd get angry on my behalf. He'd want to confront her. But I always stopped him. What good would it do? I'd say. It would just make me look like the difficult one, the one who caused a scene. It would prove her point. So I made a decision, a private vow to myself. I would not sink to her level. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break in public. I would be unimpeachable. The next time I made the apple cake, I was so careful. I grated the nutmeg fresh. I made sure the topping was just the right combination of crunchy and chewy. When I brought it over, she was sitting at her small kitchen table, doing her physical therapy exercises. She looked tired. I set the cake down. She didn't say thank you, not exactly, but she looked at it. And she said my mother used to put a dash of cloves in her apple cake. It was the first personal thing she'd ever said to me that wasn't in. I would be kind, I would be helpful, I would remember every birthday. I would ask about their lives. I would listen intently to their stories. My revenge would be my own character. And it was exhausting. Smiling, while your spirit is being crushed, takes a special kind of energy. Biting your tongue when you want to scream requires a strength I didn't know. I'd come home from a family event and just collapse into a chair feeling hollowed out. But slowly over time, I started to see little cracks in their collective opinion. His cousin's wife once pulled me aside after I'd complimented her on her garden. You know, she said quietly, "You're always so nice. I don't know how you do it." It was a small thing, but it was a lifeline. Another time, his uncle thanked me sincerely for helping him with his phone, something his own children didn't have the patience for. They were starting to see me, not the caricature she painted, but the actual person. Then she fell. It was a bad fall down the basement stairs, breaking her hip and her wrist. The hospital was a whirlwind of panic and fear. The family gathered, a chaotic mess of worry. And in that chaos, everyone was talking, but no one was doing. They were all debating the best course of action, the best surgeons, the best rehab facilities. It was all talk. And I just started doing. I saw the fear in her eyes, the real human terror of an aging woman who's been confronted with her own fragility. And in that moment, she wasn't my tormentor. She was just a scared person. I became the point person. I organized the schedule for who would visit. And when so she'd never be alone, I talked to the doctors and nurses, translating their medical jargon into plain English for the family when she came home unable to do much for herself. I was there every day. I did the grocery shopping. I cooked meals that could be easily heated up. I cleaned her house, which was something I know she was particular about. The first time I had to help her bathe, the air in the bathroom was thick with a lifetime of unspoken resentment. She couldn't look at me. Her pride was a physical presence in the room. But I was gentle, I was careful. I treated her with a dignity the situation was trying to strip away. The family saw all of it. They saw me changing bandages without flinching. They saw me patiently helping her with exercises the physical therapist had prescribed. Even when she was frustrated and lashed out at me, they saw me sitting with her for hours watching old movies, just so she wouldn't be alone with her thoughts. There was no audience for this. It was just the hard, ugly, unglamorous work of caregiving. And I did it without complaint, without seeking praise. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The change didn't happen all at once. It was a slow thaw. One afternoon, his aunt was visiting and saw me massaging her sore shoulders. The way the nurse had shown me, she didn't say anything, but she watched for a long time, and her expression was thoughtful. Another day, his brother brought over lunch and found me on my hands and knees, scrubbing a spot off her kitchen floor. Because she'd mentioned it was bothering her, he stood there for a moment just watching, and then he simply said, "Thank you." Really, the words were heavy with a new kind of respect. Accusation, it was just a statement, a piece of information. I held on to it. The real turning point came during a family meeting at her house. Everyone was there discussing her long-term recovery. She was sitting in her favorite armchair propped up with pillows, and I was perched on the arm of the sofa, just listening the conversation turn to who could take time off work to be with her during the day. There was a lot of hemming and hawing, excuses were starting to form on people's lips. And then she spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, but it filled the room. She looked directly at me. "She's the one who's been here," she said. "She's the one who knows what I need. I want her to help me." It was a complete public capitulation in front of the entire family, the very people who had witnessed years of her disdain for me. She was not just accepting me, she was choosing me. She was placing her well-being, her dignity in my hands. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then she added, her voice cracking slightly, "I don't know what I would have done without you." That was the moment the wall came down. After that it was like a floodgate opened. His aunt called me the next day, not to talk about his mother, but to invite me to lunch, just the two of us. His cousins started texting me funny memes. The brother, who had always been somewhat distant, asked for my advice on a work problem. I was no longer an outsider. I was woven into the fabric of the family. They saw the truth now. They saw that her narrative about me was a lie. The real me was the person who showed up, not the person she had invented. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't revenge in the way I had ever imagined it. There was no moment of triumph over her. There was no schadenfreude. Instead, there was a quiet, profound sense of peace. I had proven something, not to her, but to myself. I had lived by my own code. And in doing so I had won everything. I had earned a real family. I had earned respect that was deep and lasting. And most surprisingly, I had earned a fragile but genuine relationship with her. The kindness wasn't a strategy. It was just who I was, and in the end, it was the most powerful weapon I could have ever possessed. It disarmed everyone. It healed everything. The humiliation was a fire she lit to burn me, but I walked through it and came out tempered, stronger, and finally completely accepted. For years, my entire sense of self-worth was tied to a single impossible goal: winning her approval. My mother-in-law's. It wasn't just a desire. It was a need, a deep, aching need to be seen as good enough for her son, for her family. Every interaction was a test. I hadn't studied, for I would walk into a room, and my entire focus would be on her face, scanning for the slightest flicker of approval, or more often that subtle dismissal that could ruin my whole week. I remember planning for family dinners like I was preparing for a military operation. What would I wear? Something shed, fine, tasteful, not too flashy, but not too dull either. What would we talk about? I'd rehearse anecdotes in my head, little stories about work, or a book I'd read, anything that might prove I was intelligent, cultured, a worthy addition. I'd bring a dessert, but not just any dessert. It had to be homemade, but not something too complicated that would seem like I was showing off. It was an exhausting highwire act, and I always felt like I was about to fall. I started researching. I asked David's brother. I even called one of her sisters timidly and explained what I was trying to do. They told me about a potato soup their grandmother made with lots of dill. They told me about a holiday bread with raisins and cardamom. I became an archaeologist of her past, digging for recipes that were maps to her memories. Cooking became my quiet apology, my peace offering. It was a language we could both understand, without having to say the words that were too hard to say. Her rejections were never loud or dramatic. They were quiet, surgical. A comment about how she always made the gravy a different way, a pointed question about our future plans that implied my own weren't quite sufficient. A gift received with a polite, distant thank you, then set aside. Each one felt like a confirmation of a secret truth I already believed about myself, that I wasn't quite measuring up, that I was in some fundamental way inadequate. I changed everything about myself to fit into the mold I thought she wanted. I downplayed my own successes for fear of seeming boastful. I bit my tongue on opinions I knew she'd disagree with. I even started gardening because she loved her roses, spending weekends trying to cultivate a green thumb. I never had, just so I'd have something to connect with her about. It was all a performance, and I was the only one who didn't realize the audience had already left the theater. I was performing for an empty seat, and the effort was draining my soul. My happiness became a variable entirely dependent on her. If she was pleasant, I was elated. If she was cool, I was devastated. I had handed her the keys to my own emotional state, and I was miserable. The turning point didn't come from a huge fight or a dramatic scene. It came on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. I was in the grocery store staring at two different types of olive oil. One was the brand I knew she preferred, the other was the one I actually liked. And I felt this familiar anxiety starting to rise. Which one should I buy for the next family dinner? Which one would earn me a nod of approval? And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of freezers, and the smell of produce, something in me just broke, not broke down, broke open. A thought, clear and quiet, cut through the noise. Why am I doing this? I am a 35-year-old woman having an anxiety attack over olive oil. I can't control her. I have never been able to control what she thinks of me. All I can control is my own reaction. All I can control is who I choose to be. This need for her validation was a cage I had built for myself, and I was the only one who held the key. The decision felt less like a choice, and more like a surrender of a battle. I was never meant to win. I put the olive oil she liked back on the shelf, and bought the one I wanted. It was a tiny act, but it felt monumental. I was making a decision for me. That was the beginning. I decided to stop trying to earn a place at her table. I already had a place. My husband loved me. I had my own life, my own friends, my own value, that existed completely separate from her opinion. Letting go of that need was terrifying at first. It felt like jumping off a cliff. Without a parachute, what would hold me up if it lost her approval? But the fall never came. Instead, I found solid ground inside myself. I started to interact with her from a new place. It wasn't a place of neediness or fear. It was a place of quiet strength. I started speaking my mind gently, but firmly. I stopped editing my life to seem more impressive. I showed up as myself, flaws. And all the funny thing was, the less I needed her to like me, the less power she had to hurt me. Her subtle criticisms would land, but they wouldn't stick. They'd bounce off this new armor of self-respect I was building. Then she fell ill. It was a sudden, serious thing, a bad fall that led to a broken hip and a complicated surgery. The family was thrown into chaos, and my phone rang. It was my father-in-law, his voice thick with worry, asking if I could help, if I could come by the house, maybe sit with her. When he had to run errands, the old me would have seen this as the ultimate opportunity, the chance to finally prove my worth, to be the hero, to secure that approval once and for all through a grand gesture of care. The turning point was the beef stew. It was a miserable, rainy day. I brought over a big container of it with a loaf of crusty bread. She was having a bad day, frustrated with her slow progress. She was quiet. I dished out a bowl for her, and one for myself. I wasn't going to leave this time. I sat down at the table with her for a few minutes. We just ate in silence. Then she took a bite of the stew, and she paused. She looked at me, and her eyes were different, softer. She said, "The potatoes, you cut them in chunks, not." But that wasn't my first thought. My first thought was simply that she was a human being in pain, and I could help. The decision to say yes wasn't a strategy. It was an authentic expression of my own character. I am a person who helps when someone is vulnerable. It's who I am. It had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with me. So I went to her house, and I cared for her without an agenda. I didn't do it with the hope of a reward. I didn't do it to hear a thank you. I made her tea the way I make tea, not the way she might have preferred. I fluffed her pillows because she was uncomfortable, not because I wanted her to notice my effort. I sat with her in silence. When she didn't want to talk, I read to her. When she was bored, the care I provided was pure, because it was given freely with no expectation of anything in return. I found a strange, deep fulfillment in the acts themselves, in the simple humanity of tending to another person. The pressure was gone. I was just me helping someone who needed help. And something shifted in her. I think she felt the difference. The care I gave before was always laced with a desperate energy, a palpable desire for her to notice how hard I was trying. This was different. This was calm. This was steady. It was kindness offered from a place of strength, not from a place of need. One afternoon, about a week into her recovery, I was helping her from her bed to a chair. It was a slow, difficult process. She was leaning heavily on me, and I was focused entirely on supporting her weight, on making sure she didn't fall. We didn't speak. When she was finally settled in the chair, breathless and a little pale, she looked up at me, not with her usual critical gaze, but with something else, something softer. She didn't say thank you. She said, "You have a very steady way about you." It was a simple observation, but it was the first genuine, unguarded compliment she had ever given me. There was no subtext, no test. It was just a statement of fact. And in that moment, I felt nothing, no surge of victory, no overwhelming relief, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was nice. It was genuinely nice to hear, but my happiness didn't depend on it. That was the real change. Her acceptance, which I had chased for so long, had finally arrived. But it felt like an echo, a wonderful warm echo of a sound I had already made myself, the acceptance that truly mattered, was the one I had found within her eventual thawing. Her gradual inclusion of me, in a way that felt real, and not perfunctory, was a beautiful outcome. It made family gatherings easier, warmer. But it was a bonus, a lovely ironic reward for having stopped seeking a reward. The greatest change, the journey that truly mattered, was the one that happened inside me. I went from basing my worth on the approval of a difficult woman to knowing my worth was inherent. I learned that I couldn't change her, I could only change myself. And in changing myself, in finding that inner strength and self-respect, I inadvertently created the conditions where a real relationship could finally grow. The healed relationship with her is a source of joy now. But it's not the foundation of my happiness. That foundation built myself, and it's so much stronger than I ever imagined it could be. Slices, I nodded. That's how my father liked them, she said. He said slices dissolved. And then she did something she had never done before. She took another spoonful, and she said, "It's very good." It was like a dam broke, but slowly, gently. After that she started expecting my visits. I'd come in, and she'd be at the table, waiting. The television would be off. We'd eat together. The conversations were small at first. She'd talk about the physical therapist, or a program she'd watched. Then she started talking about David. As a boy, his scraped knees, his stubbornness. She told me about her own mother, about growing up in a house that always smelled of yeast and baking bread. I learned that her sharpness, her need, already knew was there. Control came from a life that had been harder than I'd ever imagined. She'd had to be tough to survive. One afternoon her health was much better, almost back to normal. I was making us tea in her kitchen. She was standing by the window looking out at the garden. I handed her the mug. She took it, and her hand, which was usually so steady, trembled just a little. She didn't look at me at first. She kept looking out the window. Her voice was low, and it cracked. She said, "I owe you an apology. I was unkind to you. I thought I was protecting my son. But I was just being a stubborn old woman." She finally turned to look at me, and her eyes were glistening. "When I was sick, when I couldn't do anything for myself, you were the one who came. You didn't have to. You fed me. You took care of me." She took a shaky breath. "You have been more family to me than anyone." This past Sunday, we had everyone over for dinner at our house. David, his brother Sarah, and their kids. And she arrived with a bouquet of flowers from her garden. She walked straight into the kitchen, not as a guest, but as a fixture. She nudged me aside with her hip to check the gravy. "Needs a pinch more pepper," she said. And she handed me the meal. It was so easy, so natural. We all sat down around the table. The room was loud with laughter and chatter. David was telling a story, and his mother was laughing, a real genuine laugh that lit up her whole face. She caught my eye from across the table, and she smiled, a warm, unguarded smile. She raised her glass slightly, just a tiny gesture, just for me. And in that moment, sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by the people I loved, I finally felt it, not like I was being allowed in, but like I had always belonged. The wall was gone. There was no more us and them. There was just family. And it was a warmth that started deep in my chest, a warmth I had cooked into existence, one careful, deliberate meal at a time. You have to understand, my mother-in-law wasn't just difficult. She was a fortress, a meticulously constructed fortress of old-world manners and quiet, unshakable judgment. From the very first day I met her, I could feel the assessment happening. It was in the way her eyes would linger on my clothes, my job, the way I held my fork. It was never a loud disapproval, never a scene. It was a constant, low-grade chill in the air whenever I was around. I spent the first year trying to win her over with charm. I'd laugh a little too loudly at her dry jokes. I'd bring her gifts. I thought she'd appreciate little trinkets and books. They were always received with a polite, distant thank you, and then placed to the side, never to be mentioned again. Every family dinner was a performance, and I was the understudy, desperately trying to learn lines I'd never been given. I'd leave those gatherings exhausted, my face aching from the forced smile. I felt like I was melt a glacier with a match. The turning point came after a particularly tense holiday. She'd made a comment about my career, something about it not being a lasting profession, and I'd bitten my tongue so hard I thought it would bleed later. That night, lying in bed, the frustration was like a physical weight on my chest. And then a strange clarity washed over me. I was approaching this all wrong. I was reacting. I was letting her set the terms of every interaction. This wasn't a battle of wills, it was a chess game, and I had been playing checkers. Then near the end of the meal, David went to the restroom. The moment he was out of sight, the mask dropped completely. She leaned forward, her voice low and flat, devoid of any warmth at all. She said, "I want you to understand something. David is a good man from a good family. You might be married to him, "But you will never be family," she said it so calmly, so finally. It wasn't anger, it was a statement of fact, like she was telling me the sky is blue. And then she leaned back and took a sip of her water as I decided to stop taking it personally. I had to. Her resistance wasn't really about me, not the core of me, it was a symptom of something else. Was it protectiveness over her son? A fear of being replaced, grief over the changing family dynamic? Or was it just pure simple stubbornness, a personality carved from granite? I realized I didn't need to know the exact reason, I just needed to understand that the reason existed outside of my control. My goal shifted, it was to force her to like me. That was a futile objective. My goal was to become, through sheer, undeniable consistency, someone she could not logically or emotionally dismiss. I would make her rejection of me the irrational act, not my presence. So I began my campaign. I called it the principle of unbroken kindness. It was a conscious, deliberate strategy. I committed to a policy of relentless, genuine courtesy and care, completely detached from her response. The key was that it couldn't be a performance, it had to become who I was in relation to her. If it was fake, she would smell it from a mile away. This woman had a radar for insincerity. It started with small practical things. When we'd visit, I'd notice the garbage was full, and I'd take it out. Without asking, I'd see her struggling to reach a high shelf, and I'd casually get the thing down for her. I made a point to remember the important dates, not just her birthday, but the anniversary of her husband's passing, her dog's birthday, the day she always planted her tomatoes. I'd send a simple text, "Thinking of you today." No expectation of a reply, often there wasn't one. The internal challenge was the hardest part. It was a constant battle against my own pride. The urge to keep score was overwhelming. I'd think I remembered your anniversary, and you couldn't even wish me a happy birthday. I had to actively silence that voice. This wasn't a transaction. This was an investment. I had to train myself to derive satisfaction from the act itself, not the outcome. I learned to manage my frustration by viewing each small act as a single brick I was laying in a very, very long path. My husband noticed the change. He'd whisper, "You don't have to try so hard." But I'd shake my head. It wasn't about trying hard anymore. It was about being consistent. It was about building a new normal. The frostiness didn't disappear, but the overt criticism did. The comments about my job stopped. The pointed remarks about my family faded. She just became quiet around me, observant. I took that as progress. The absence of hostility was a victory. Then the opportunity presented itself. It wasn't a small thing, it was a crisis. She fell ill, quite seriously. It was a sudden, frightening thing that left her weak and bedridden. Her son, my husband, had a demanding job. He couldn't leave her. Other children lived hours away. The responsibility fell naturally to me. I remember the phone call, the panic in my husband's voice. And I remember the strange calm that settled over me. This was it. This was the ultimate test of the strategy. This was the moment all those small bricks I'd laid would have to form a foundation strong enough to bear a real weight. I stepped up without a moment's hesitation. I rearranged my work schedule. I took on the role of primary caregiver. It wasn't glamorous, it was medicine schedules and bland meals. It was helping her to the bathroom and changing bedsheets. It was sitting for hours in a quiet room just reading. While she slept, there were moments of profound awkwardness. The first time I had to help her wash up, the air was thick with her humiliation. She was a fiercely independent woman, and this vulnerability was a torment for her. I tried to be clinical, gentle, and respectful. I'd talk about mundane things, the weather, a book I was reading, to fill the silence and give her dignity back. If she'd just commented on the wine. There was one afternoon, about a week into her illness, she was feeling particularly low, and she refused to eat the soup I'd brought. She turned her face to the wall, and she said it. The words she'd probably held back for years. Her voice was weak, but the sentiment was sharp as ever. "You don't have to do this, y'all. Never be family, you know. You can stop pretending." The old me would have cried. The old me would have felt that sting deep in my heart and maybe even walked out. But the strategic me, the patient me, just felt a wave of pity. This was her last line of defense. She was testing me, throwing her worst weapon at me to see if I would finally break. I smoothed her blanket and said very calmly, "I'm not pretending. And whether I'm family or not, you're my husband's mother, and you need help, so I'm here." I left the soup on the bedside table and went back to my chair. I didn't look at her. I just picked up my book and started reading again. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence. The air had changed. The next day she ate the soup. She didn't thank me, but she ate it a few days later. She asked me a question about my work. It was a simple thing, how is that project going? But it was the first time she had ever expressed any curiosity about my life. It was a crack in the fortress wall. Her recovery was slow, but as her strength returned, something else was being rebuilt. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. The careful distance was gone. She stopped addressing me through my husband. Shed, call me directly. Shed, ask for my opinion on things. The kindness was no longer a one-way street. Shed, insist I take a break, that I looked tired. She started sharing things with me, little stories about my husband when he was a boy, things I'd never heard before. The victory wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was in the way she said my name. It wasn't her, or she anymore, it was my name. The final moment came about a month after she was back on her feet. We were sitting in her garden drinking tea. It was a warm, peaceful afternoon. She was quiet for a long time, just watching the birds. Then she turned to me, and her eyes, usually so guarded, were soft. She reached over and put her hand on mine. Her skin was thin, papery. She said, I don't know what I would have done without you. That was it. There was no grand apology, no dramatic declaration. But those 9 words were everything. They were the surrender I had never sought, but had patiently earned. Y'all, never be family had been replaced with I don't know what I would have done without you. In her language, that was a proclamation of love. The relationship we have now is one I couldn't have imagined in those early cold years. There's a deep, unshakable respect and affection that feels earned, and therefore more precious. She relies on me now, not just for practical things, but for companionship. We talk, really talk, and the lesson I learned, the core of it all, is that sometimes the most powerful strategy, the most subversive act, is not a clever argument or a well-timed retort. It's persistent, patient goodness. It's showing up day after day with a quiet heart. You can't argue against kindness. Eventually, it just becomes the truth. The first time I met her, your grandmother, I knew I was being measured against a standard I couldn't possibly meet. It was in her living room, all delicate china and heavy dark furniture. The air smelled like lemon polish and old roses. She took my hand, and her grip was firm, her eyes scanning me not unkindly, but with a deep, unspoken scrutiny. She saw my dark hair, my skin, my features, and I saw the calculation happening behind her polite smile. I was a variable she hadn't accounted for in the life. After that, every family event was a special kind of torture. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays. I'd put on a brave face. I'd bring a dish. I'd try to make conversation with her sisters, with David's cousins. But I always felt her gaze on me. I was an outsider, a guest, who'd overstayed their welcome. I'd see the way she was with David's brother's wife, Sarah, the easy laughter, the hugs. That was for family. For me, it was a stiff, cold nod. I felt like I was living in a house with a wall down the middle of it. Of her son. The differences were never shouted from the rooftops. They were whispered in the quiet moments, woven into the fabric of every family gathering. Shed, ask me about American holidays, even though I'd lived here just as long as your father. Shed, compliment my English, as if surprised I'd mastered it. But the real battleground was always the kitchen. At Thanksgiving, I offered to bring a dish, something from my family. I described it, the slow-cooked spices, the vibrant colors. Her smile was tight. Oh, how interesting. Shed, say, but let's not confuse everyone's. Well, just stick with the traditional turkey and stuffing. My food was too strange, too loud, too foreign for her pristine table. The aromas that reminded me of home, of my mother, were to her merely unappetizing. I tried for so long to shrink myself to fit into her world. I learned her recipes, the bland roasts, the casseroles topped with canned soup. I set my own heritage aside like a book I couldn't afford to read. I wanted so badly for her to see me, just me, not the culture I came from. But the more I tried to assimilate, the more I felt like a ghost in my own life. I was erasing myself piece by piece. And for what? A polite, distant acceptance that never truly came. The rejection wasn't a slap, it was a slow, constant chill. The turning point came on a quiet Tuesday. I was making dinner, just for us, for you and your father. I'd had a particularly difficult phone call with my own mother, feeling that ache of homesickness that never really goes away. And I decided enough. I pulled out the large clay pot my aunt had given me, the one that had traveled across an ocean. I gathered the spices from the back of the cupboard, the ones I'd hidden away. The scent of toasting cumin and coriander seeds filled the house, and it was like a spell being broken. You were just a toddler, then sitting on the kitchen floor, watching me with wide, curious eyes. That first meal was a revelation. Your father, who had only ever known his mother's cooking, took a hesitant bite. Then another, his face shifting from curiosity to genuine delight. You, my little one, loved the bright colors, The new textures, you smeared it on your face with a happy giggle. This wasn't just food, it was a story, it was my story. And seeing you too, enjoy it, seeing it become a part of our family's story, gave me a strength I hadn't felt in years. I started cooking our food, more often the rich, slow-simmered stews, the flatbreads wed tear apart with our hands, the salads bursting with herbs and lemon. Our kitchen became a place of warmth and scent, and memory I stopped hiding. Your grandmother would visit, and she'd notice the air in our home was different now. She'd walk in, and her nostrils would flare slightly, taking in the unfamiliar aromatic steam. She never said anything, but I'd see her watching us, watching you children eagerly eat things she couldn't even name. There was a curiosity there underneath the disapproval, a silent question she was too proud to ask. She saw the joy it brought to her son, the excitement it brought to her grandchildren. The wall she had built was still there, but I was always on the wrong side. David saw it. He tried to reassure me, but what could he do? It was his mother. The strain started to affect us too. We'd argue in the car on the way home from every visit. I'd be hurt, he'd be defensive. It was a cycle that just kept spinning. Could see a tiny crack beginning to form. Then she got sick. It was a bad flu that wiped her out completely. She was bedridden for days, and she had no appetite. The chicken soup your father brought her, the same one Shed made for him, his whole life, sat untouched on her nightstand. She was getting weaker, and we were all worried. I was sitting with her one afternoon, the room dim and quiet. She looked so small in that big bed, paler than I'd ever seen her. She turned her head away from another offered tray of bland food. I just can't, she whispered, her voice thin. And I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the sight of her so vulnerable, maybe it was the confidence I'd found in my own kitchen. But I leaned forward, and I said very softly, "Let me make you something from my family. It's very light, very soothing. It's what my mother would make for me when I was unwell." She looked at me, really looked at me. And for a moment all the prejudice and distance was gone, replaced by simple human weariness. There was a long silence. I saw the internal struggle. Lifetime of bias warring with a basic physical need for comfort. Finally, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," she whispered, "if it's no trouble." I went home, and I worked with a focus I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't about proving a point. This was about care. I chose the simplest, most healing dish. I knew, a gentle broth with rice, but infused with ginger and turmeric, a few whole spices, to scent it, finished with a squeeze of fresh lime. It was the color of sunshine. I strained it until it was perfectly clear, carrying only the essence of its ingredients. I brought it back to her house, in a thermos, the warmth radiating through the container. I poured a small bowl for her. The steam rose, carrying the warm, clean scent of ginger into the room. She hesitated, then took a spoonful. She blew on it softly and brought it to her lips. Her eyes were closed. She swallowed. Then she opened them, and they were different. There was no dramatic gasp, no grand pronouncement, just a slow, deep breath. "It's warm," she said. "It feels good." She finished the entire bowl. It was the first real meal Shed kept down in days. A few days later, when she was sitting up in bed, she asked, her voice still weak, "That broth, what was in it?" It wasn't an accusation, it was a genuine question. So I told her. I sat in the chair beside her bed, and I talked about ginger, how it settles the stomach. I talked about turmeric, its golden color, how it's used in my culture for healing. I told her about my mother, standing over her own stove, making this exact same soup for me when I was a child with a fever. That question was the key that unlocked the door. As she recovered, her requests became more frequent. "Could you make that dish with the lentils?" Shed asked, "or the one with the eggplant and the tomatoes?" It started with the food, but it slowly became about everything else. Shed asked me what certain words meant. She asked about the festivals. Shed's seen pictures of the food was a bridge, and she was finally tentatively walking across it. One evening, I was teaching you how to roll the dough for the flatbreads. Your grandmother was there watching from the kitchen table. Shed been quiet for a long time. You were laughing, your hands covered in flour. I looked over at her and saw she had tears in her eyes. I thought maybe she was upset that the old discomfort had returned. But she stood up and walked over to the counter. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched our hands, yours and mine, working the dough. Then the call came. It was a Tuesday morning. David's voice on the phone was tight, strained. His mother had collapsed, a stroke. It was serious in that moment. Every bit of resentment, every hurtful word, it just vanished, replaced by this cold, sharp fear for David, for her. We rushed to the hospital. She looked so small in that bed, surrounded by wires and machines. All that formidable strength was gone. She was fragile, pale. Then she turned to me, and her voice was quiet but clear. I was wrong. She said. The house was silent. Except for the hum of the refrigerator. I was wrong about your food. She paused, gathering her words, and looked me directly in the eye. The wall was gone. And I was wrong about you. I was afraid of what I didn't understand. I thought I was protecting something. But all I was doing was closing a door on all of this. She gestured around the kitchen at the vibrant colors of the ingredients. At you. At me. You have given my son and my grandchildren a gift I never could. You've given them a whole world. And you were kind enough to offer it to me even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for that soup. It healed more than just my body that day. She didn't ask for the recipe that evening. Instead, she asked if she could try to roll the dough with us. Her hands, usually so precise and sure, were clumsy with the unfamiliar task. You showed her how, your small hand guiding hers. And there, we were, the three of us, covered in flour, bridging the gap, not with grand gestures, but with something as simple and as profound as bread. For years, her house felt less like a home, and more like a throne room. You could feel it the moment you stepped inside, a kind of heavy quiet in the air. The furniture was all arranged, just so the pictures on the walls were perfectly straight, and everything was spotless. It was a kingdom. She ruled with absolute authority, and I was the permanent visitor, the one who never quite belonged. I remember one Thanksgiving early on. I was in the kitchen trying to help, just trying to feel useful. I was mashing the potatoes, and she came up beside me. She didn't say anything at first, just watched my hands. Then, in a voice that was quiet enough that no one else could hear but sharp enough to cut right through me, she said, "You're holding that wrong. Y'all never get the lumps out." Like that, she took the masher from my hands without asking, and finished the job herself. It was a small thing, but it was a pattern. Comment about how I dressed my son, a pointed question about our finances, a subtle correction of a story my husband was telling. Every interaction was a reminder of my place. I was on the outside. The big declaration, the one that hung in the air for years, happened at a family reunion. It was a crowded, noisy event. But she found a moment, when we were relatively alone near the drinks table. She was refilling her glass of iced tea, and I was just standing there. She looked at me, and her eyes were just cold. She said, "You know, you can marry into a family, but that doesn't make you part of it. Y'all never be family, not really." She said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, like she was stating the weather, and then she just turned and walked away to talk to someone else. It was like she'd dismissed me. That sentence became the wall I lived behind. At every holiday, every birthday, I felt like I was performing a part, smiling, nodding, trying to blend into the background. I was seeking an approval I knew I would never get. It was exhausting. The power was always hers. She decided the mood, the topics of conversation, who was in favor, and who was not. I was just a guest in her world. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping thing. First, she started forgetting little things, names, dates. Then she became unsteady on her feet. The strong, imposing woman who commanded every room began to look smaller. The illness was a thief. It stole her strength, her sharpness, her independence. The family was thrown into chaos. They were so used to her being the rock, the one who had everything under control. Suddenly, she was the one who needed control. She needed help getting dressed, needed meals prepared, needed someone to make sure she took her medication. The recovery was long and slow. She lost a lot of mobility on her right side. She couldn't cook for herself, could barely get around her own apartment. David and his brother were trying to arrange everything, nurses, therapists, but they both had jobs, families. The stress was eating David alive. He wasn't sleeping. I saw him one evening just sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and I just knew what I had to do. The rest of the family fluttered around her like nervous birds. They didn't know what to do. They were afraid of breaking her, of saying the wrong thing. They treated her with a kind of fragile, distant pity that I could see just made her angry and ashamed. She hated it. She hated the weakness more than anything. I'd walk into a room and see the look on her face. It wasn't the cold, powerful matriarch anymore. It was the face of a frightened, proud woman who was losing her grip on everything. The power imbalance, the structure that had defined our relationship for over a decade, was just gone. The field was level, but it was a bleak, terrifying kind of level ground. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. My husband was overwhelmed with work. His siblings lived hours away. Someone had to step in, and it had to be someone who could be there every day. Logically, it fell to me. But it was more than logic. Seeing her like that, stripped of all her defenses, something shifted in me too. The resentment I'd carried for years felt too heavy to hold onto in the face of such raw vulnerability. This wasn't about winning anymore. There was no battle to win. This was about one Human being helping another. The first time I had to help her bathe, I thought she would refuse. I thought she'd rather do anything than let me see her. That way I prepared myself for a fight. But when I came into the bathroom, she was just sitting on the stool, wrapped in a towel, her head bowed. She didn't look at me. She just let me help her. Her shoulders were so thin I could see every vertebra in her spine. And in that moment, she wasn't my powerful mother-in-law. She was just a sick, scared woman. My hands were steady as I helped her. Tried to be gentle, to be efficient, to give her as much dignity as I could. I talked softly about mundane things, about the weather, about a show I'd seen on TV. Just to fill the silence. She didn't say a word, but she didn't resist. That's when the new power dynamic began. It was a quiet power, the power of competence. I learned her medication schedule. I figured out what foods she could eat easily. I knew how to adjust the pillows to ease her pain. The family started calling me. What time does she take the blue pill? Does the doctor want to see her this week? I became the source of information, the one who knew how to handle the situation. They started to look at me differently. There was a new respect in their eyes. It wasn't the fearful respect they gave her, it was a grateful, relieved respect. I was holding everything together. The real change happened late one afternoon. The house was quiet. She was resting in her chair by the window, and I was sitting across from her reading. The sun was coming and making the dust motes dance in the air. She spoke, and her voice was so quiet I almost missed it. She said, "I was wrong about you." I looked up from my book. She was staring out the window, not at me. She said, "All those years, I thought you were weak. I thought you were just clinging to my son. I thought you wouldn't last." She paused for a long time, gathering her breath. "But it turns out you're the strong one. I see that now." I said, "I'll do it. I'll take care of the meals. I'll go over there." He looked at me, his eyes full of this mixture of gratitude and worry. "Are you sure?" he asked. After everything she said, I wasn't sure. But I knew it was the only thing to do. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about him. It was about what was right. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was an admission, an acknowledgement. And in that admission, she was giving me a new kind of power, the power of being seen. She was finally seeing me not as the outsider who invaded her family, but as the person who was holding her hand when she was afraid, who was making her soup when she couldn't eat, who was ensuring she had some comfort and dignity at the end of her life. After that, something between us softened. The air in the room felt different. We found a new equilibrium. We could sit together in silence, without it being hostile. Sometimes we'd even talk. She'd tell me stories about my husband when he was a little boy, things I'd never heard before. I saw a glimpse of the woman she was before she built all those walls, before she felt she had to control everything. And I think she saw me too, not just as a caregiver, but as a person with my own strengths and vulnerabilities. The ultimate power move wasn't taking over her role. It wasn't about becoming the new matriarch. It was about transforming the very nature of the power between us. It was about choosing compassion over conquest. The power wasn't in ruling anymore. It was in connecting. We had both seen each other at our most vulnerable. I had seen her stripped of her strength, and she had seen my capacity for a kindness. She never thought I had. The hierarchy was gone. In its place was something much more fragile, but also much more real, a mutual respect, a quiet understanding. We had finally found a way to be family, not because we had to, but because we had, in the strangest way possible, earned it. It started with a photograph. Your father-in-law, he was showing me some old albums one afternoon. Trying to fill the silence of one of our visits, he pulled out a worn leather-bound book, the pages brittle and yellowed. And there she was, my mother-in-law. But not the woman I knew. This was a girl, maybe 17. She was standing on the steps of a building I didn't recognize, clutching a small suitcase. Her expression, a mixture of fierce determination and sheer terror. She was an immigrant alone. She had come here with nothing but a dress and a hope for a better life. He told me the story she never would, how the family she married into, your father's family, they never truly accepted her. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't know the right ways, who spoke with the wrong accent. Her own mother-in-law, your father's mother, had apparently been a formidable woman. Cold. She's the one who reportedly said to her more than once, "You will always be an outsider. Here you will never truly be family." And I felt the floor drop out from under me, because those words, they were so familiar. They were the same words, the exact same phrasing, that my mother-in-law had said to me in a moment of quiet fury during our first holiday together. "You will never be family." It wasn't an original insult. It was a relic, a ghost. It was a pain she had endured, internalized. And now, decades later, she was handing it down to me like a cursed heirloom. Hurt people, hurt people. It's such a simple phrase, but in that moment it stopped being a cliché and became a profound, chilling truth. Her behavior wasn't really about me, not entirely. It was about a script written, long before I entered the scene, a role she was forcing me to play, the role of the outsider, just as she had been cast. Understanding that didn't magically erase the sting. It still hurt, but it changed the nature of the hurt. It was no longer a personal attack I had to defend against. It was a symptom of a deep festering wound. My anger began to cool, replaced by this awful heavy pity. I looked at her across the dinner table after that, and I saw not just a difficult woman, but a girl on a steamship, scared and hoping for a welcome that never fully came. It reframed everything. It didn't excuse the cruelty, but